It was a bright morning in the middle of summer. The streets of the small city were already busy with people heading to work, children waiting for buses, and shop owners opening their doors. The air felt light, filled with the quiet sounds of another day beginning. At the corner of the main street stood Riverside National Bank, a tall glass building with shiny windows that caught the morning light. Inside, everything looked neat and calm. The faint smell of coffee mixed with the soft hum of computers and the sound of shoes against the polished floor. Behind the counters, the employees were settling into their day. Some were checking emails, others were helping the first customers. The branch manager, a woman named Linda, was standing near her office door with a cup of coffee in her hand. She was known for being strict but efficient. She liked everything to go smoothly, and she didn't have much patience for surprises. At 9:10 a.m., the glass door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, dressed neatly in a dark blue suit with a silver tie. His shoes were well polished and he carried a brown leather folder in his hand. He had a calm, confident way of moving, like someone who was used to being in important places. Some of the staff looked up for a moment. The man gave a polite smile as he walked toward the counter. He didn't seem in a hurry, but there was a quiet seriousness in his face. "Good morning," he said to the young teller behind the counter. "I'm here to discuss an issue with a business account. I believe I need to speak with the manager." The teller nodded and glanced toward Linda's office. "Of course, sir. May I have your name, please?" "James Carter," he said. "From Carter Holdings." The teller's eyebrows lifted slightly. She didn't recognize the name, but it sounded important. She turned and called out softly, "Ms. Prescott, someone's here to see you." Linda looked up from her computer and noticed the man at the counter. She nodded, put down her coffee, and walked over with her usual polite smile. "Good morning, sir. I'm Linda Prescott, the branch manager. How can I help you today?" James returned the smile. "Good morning. I'm here regarding a discrepancy in our company's main account. One of our transfers seems to have been delayed. I brought all the relevant papers and IDs if you'd like to take a look." He handed her the folder. Linda took it, but as she flipped through the documents, her smile faded slightly. The figures were large, very large. The account number was tied to a business fund worth several $1,000,000. "That's quite a sum," she said, trying to sound casual. "And you're the authorized representative for this account?" "Yes," James said calmly. "I'm the chairman of the company. We usually handle our accounts through this branch." Linda nodded, though her mind was already racing. She had never met this man before, and she was sure she would remember someone like him if he was a regular client. She looked again at the paperwork, checking for anything that seemed off. Everything appeared to be in order, yet she couldn't shake a small doubt forming in the back of her mind. Something about the situation made her uneasy. She looked up and studied him more closely. The calm way he stood, his watch, the expensive briefcase. Everything about him looked professional, but in her mind a quiet voice whispered, "What if it's fake?" "Of course," she said finally, keeping her voice friendly. "Would you mind waiting for a few minutes while I verify these details?" "Not at all," James replied. Taking a seat near the corner of the lobby, he sat quietly, scrolling through his phone, unaware of the small storm beginning to brew around him. Linda went back to her office, closed the door halfway, and began searching through the bank system. The account number he provided was real. The name matched. The signature on file matched too. Everything looked correct. Still, she hesitated. She called one of her assistant managers. "Can you come here for a moment?" The assistant, a younger woman named Hannah, entered the office. "Yes, ma'am." Linda turned the screen toward her. "Take a look at this. A man out there claims to be the chairman of this company. Says he needs to sort out a transfer issue. Does that name ring a bell to you?" Hannah squinted at the name. "Carter Holdings? Sounds familiar. I think they're one of our top corporate clients. I saw the name on the monthly report." Linda nodded slowly. "That's what I thought too, but I've never met him before. I find it strange that someone handling an account like this would just walk in. Usually they schedule meetings or handle things through corporate." Hannah hesitated. "Maybe he prefers to handle it personally." "Maybe," Linda said, though her tone showed she wasn't convinced. "Can you check our client file and confirm if this man's ID matches the authorized name?" Hannah took the copy of the ID and left the room. Linda looked out through the glass wall at James. He was still sitting quietly, scrolling on his phone. A few customers had come in since, but her eyes kept drifting back to him. She noticed the way he occasionally looked up, as if aware he was being watched. She turned away quickly, feeling a small sting of guilt but brushing it off. "I'm just doing my job," she told herself. 15 minutes passed. Hannah returned holding the file. "The ID matches and the signature does too," she said. "Everything seems fine," Linda frowned. "Everything seems fine," she repeated softly. "Then why do I still feel something's wrong?" She walked out again, pretending to check the lobby. James looked up and smiled politely. "Any updates?" he asked kindly. "We're just verifying a few details, Mr. Carter," she said. "It shouldn't take long." "No problem," he replied. "I appreciate your time." His tone was calm, patient, too patient, she thought. Something in her mind kept twisting normal signs of professionalism into suspicion. Maybe it was because the transaction involved millions, or maybe because she'd seen stories of scams before. She couldn't be sure. Still, a quiet unease grew stronger. Another 10 minutes passed. James checked his watch. He had a meeting across town in an hour. He didn't like to rush people, but the delay was getting long. He stood and approached the counter again. "Excuse me," he said gently to the teller. "I was just wondering if there's any update. I have a meeting soon, but I'd like to get this sorted." The teller smiled nervously. "Of course, sir. I'll ask the manager again." She went to Linda's office. "He's asking for an update," she whispered. Linda sighed, staring at her computer screen. "Something doesn't feel right," she said. "Call the corporate verification line again. And," she hesitated, lowering her voice, "keep him seated." The teller looked unsure. "Do you think—" "Just do it," Linda said firmly. When the teller returned, she asked James politely to sit down again. He nodded, though confusion flickered in his eyes. Linda stood near her desk, phone in hand, pacing slightly. She wasn't sure what she was looking for anymore. All the facts checked out, but her mind kept circling back to that same uneasy feeling. What if this is one of those scams that look completely real until it's too late? She opened a message window on her computer, typing quick notes for internal security. Then she picked up the phone again and made a decision she thought was playing it safe. Meanwhile, James sat quietly, unaware of what was happening. He noticed the tellers glancing in his direction more than once. A man at the next counter gave him a quick, curious look. James offered a polite nod but could sense the change in atmosphere. The bank lobby felt different now, quieter, heavier. He straightened his jacket and looked toward Linda's office, but she didn't meet his eyes. She was speaking into her phone, her face tight with focus. From where he sat, he couldn't hear the words, but her tone made him uneasy. Then, as she hung up the call, she exhaled deeply and walked back toward the counter, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine," she said. "We're just running an additional verification for your safety as well." James nodded, still polite. "I appreciate that. Take your time." Inside, though, he began to wonder if something more was happening. The minutes ticked by slowly. Outside the large glass windows, traffic moved as usual. People passed by, unaware of the small misunderstanding growing inside the building. Linda looked at the clock again. 15 minutes since the call. She felt her heart beat faster. She tried to appear calm, pretending to organize files, but her mind was racing. Hannah finally leaned toward her and whispered, "Are you sure about this?" Linda didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door, waiting. James, still seated, glanced toward the glass entrance too, as if he could sense something coming. The lobby was quiet, almost too quiet now. Even the sound of typing seemed to stop, and then, faintly from outside, came the sound of sirens. They were distant at first, barely noticeable, but growing louder, closer, cutting through the normal city noise. James looked up, puzzled. The teller froze mid-gesture. Hannah's face turned pale. Linda kept her eyes on the door, trying not to show the sudden rush of fear in her chest. She told herself she had done the right thing, that she was only being careful. But as the sound of the sirens grew louder, even she began to wonder if she had made a mistake that couldn't be easily undone. The sirens grew louder outside, and everyone inside the bank began to notice. A few customers turned their heads toward the large glass windows. No one said anything yet, but the sound carried a sense of tension that filled the room. James lifted his head and looked toward the door, confused but calm. He had no idea what was going on, yet he could feel the mood around him changing. The teller at the counter glanced nervously toward the manager's office. Linda stood behind her desk, pretending to stay busy, but her fingers trembled slightly as she rearranged the same papers over and over. Within moments, 2 police cars stopped right outside the entrance. The flashing lights reflected off the glass walls, coloring the lobby with red and blue streaks. James frowned softly, his confusion turning into unease. He didn't move. He didn't want to make assumptions, but the timing felt too close to ignore. The door opened and 2 officers walked in quickly. They weren't aggressive, but their expressions were serious. They scanned the lobby before one of them spoke. "Good morning," the taller officer said. "We received a call about a possible suspicious individual inside the bank." The room went silent. You could almost hear the air leave everyone's lungs at once. Linda stepped forward immediately, trying to appear composed. "Yes, I'm the one who called," she said. "It's just a safety precaution. There's a customer here requesting access to a high-value account. I just wanted to be sure everything was legitimate." The officer nodded slightly, then turned toward James. "Sir, can we speak with you for a moment?" James looked up at them, his face calm but clearly surprised. "Of course," he said, standing slowly. "Is there a problem? Could we see your ID, please?" The officer asked politely. James reached into his jacket pocket and handed over his wallet. His voice stayed even, though there was a hint of disbelief behind his tone. "I'm not sure why this is happening, but here's my identification. And this," he added, handing over another card, "is my business card." The officers looked down at the ID. It clearly read James Carter. The business card matched the same name, with the title Chairman and Founder Carter Holdings. The second officer raised his eyebrows slightly. He looked at his partner, then back at James. "You're the chairman of Carter Holdings?" "Yes," James said simply. "Is there a problem with that?" The taller officer hesitated, unsure of what to say. He turned toward Linda. "Ma'am, did you verify this information before calling us?" Linda's face went pale. I checked the documents, yes. But the amount of money involved and, well, I just wanted to be sure everything was real. It didn't seem normal for someone to just walk in like that." The officer nodded slowly, not saying much. He looked back at James. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry for the confusion. We just have to confirm a few things and we'll be on our way." James sighed softly, his shoulders relaxing just a little. He nodded. "Do what you need to do. I'll wait." He sat back down quietly while the officers stepped aside to make a few calls. The other customers whispered to each other, trying not to stare but unable to look away completely. The tellers pretended to focus on their work, but their faces showed the same quiet embarrassment spreading through the room. For the next 10 minutes, the officers made verification calls. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The man sitting quietly in the lobby wasn't some stranger or con artist. He was indeed the chairman of one of the largest local companies, and one of the bank's most important clients. When the taller officer got off the phone, his expression had changed completely. He walked back over to James with a look of deep regret. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I want to apologize sincerely. Everything checks out. You are who you say you are. There was a misunderstanding." James gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I see. Well, I'm glad it's all clear now." He stood up, buttoning his jacket. His movements were calm, controlled. He wasn't angry, at least not outwardly, but there was a quiet weight in his presence that filled the room more than any raised voice could have. Linda finally stepped closer, her face tight with embarrassment. "Mr. Carter, I'm so sorry for the confusion," she said. "I just wanted to ensure everything was secure." "You have to understand." James turned to face her gently. "I understand the importance of security," he said softly. "But I also understand the importance of judgment. You had all the information you needed in front of you." Linda's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She stood frozen, realizing how quickly her assumptions had led to this moment. The officers nodded politely toward James. "Again, our apologies, sir," one said before they turned to leave. As the door closed behind them, the sound of the sirens faded away, but the silence left inside the bank was even louder. James looked around the room. Every employee had gone quiet. Every eye avoided his. Even the customers looked down, pretending to check their phones. He walked back to the counter and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "If we can return to the reason I came here, "I'd like to finalize that account transfer now." The teller nodded quickly. "Of course, sir," she said, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled up the account details. Linda stepped aside, not sure what else to do. Her face was flushed, her heart still beating fast. She tried to help, but James didn't look at her again. He focused only on finishing his business. The next few minutes passed quietly. No one dared to say much. The papers were signed, the documents processed, and everything that had seemed so complicated at the start was resolved in minutes. When it was done, James picked up his folder and turned to leave. But before walking out, he paused near the entrance and looked back at Linda. His voice was calm, but his words carried a quiet strength. "You could have just asked," he said. Then he walked out of the building, the glass doors closing gently behind him. The sound of his footsteps faded into the street, leaving behind a room full of silence and regret. For a long time, no one moved. Linda stood still near her office door, replaying everything that had just happened in her mind. The sound of the sirens, the look on his face, the way everyone had stared, it all echoed like a heavy reminder of how one quick decision could lead to so much embarrassment. Finally, she turned to her staff. "Let's get back to work," she said softly. But even as the day went on, the mood inside the bank never returned to normal. That evening, after closing hours, Linda sat alone in her office. The blinds were drawn halfway, and the golden light of sunset spilled across her desk. She looked down at the same documents she had seen that morning, the ones that had been perfectly valid all along. Her chest felt tight. She took a deep breath, but it didn't help much. She thought about the man's calm voice, his patience, the way he never raised his tone even after everything. She remembered how he had looked at her, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. Somehow that felt worse than being yelled at. She sat there for a long time thinking about what had pushed her to make that call. She told herself it was just about being careful, about following procedure. But deep down she knew there was something else, something she didn't want to admit. She remembered the small doubt that had crept into her mind when she first saw him. The voice that whispered what if before she even had a reason to question him. It was that small, silent voice that had led her to call the police, and now she had to live with that choice. At home that night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scene again. The flashing lights, the quiet stares, the man's calm, steady face. She wondered what he must have felt sitting there, being questioned in front of strangers. She wondered if he had experienced this kind of moment before. The thought made her stomach twist uncomfortably. The next morning, Linda walked into work early. She wanted to avoid the looks from her staff, but she could feel them anyway. The quiet judgment, the awkward silence that followed her wherever she went. The story had already started to spread. Someone had recorded a short video of the police walking into the bank. It was already online. The title read, "Bank calls police on businessman, turns out he's the chairman." By noon, people across town were talking about it. Customers came in whispering. The regional office called for an explanation. The bank's corporate team wanted to review the incident. Linda sat through the meeting, answering questions, explaining her reasoning, repeating the same words over and over. I was just being cautious, but every time she said it, it sounded weaker, even to her own ears. When the meeting ended, she sat quietly in her chair long after everyone had left. She looked out the window, watching people walk by outside. Ordinary people going about their lives, unaware of how quickly a single judgment could change everything. Across town, James was sitting in his office, looking out over the city skyline. His phone buzzed with messages, reporters, friends, employees. Everyone wanted to know what had happened at the bank. He sighed and put the phone down. He didn't want to turn it into a big story, but he knew it already was. The video was spreading fast and people were reacting with anger and disbelief. He leaned back in his chair thinking. He wasn't angry anymore, but he was tired. Tired of moments like this, tired of having to prove who he was over and over again. He thought about the look on the manager's face when she realized her mistake. It wasn't hatred. It was fear mixed with embarrassment and something else. Shame, maybe. He could still remember her voice trying to explain herself. He had heard that same tone too many times before. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. He didn't want to let this moment become just another story of anger. He wanted it to mean something more. That thought stayed with him as the day ended and night fell over the city. Back at the bank, Linda locked up the branch and stepped outside into the cool night air. She stood there for a long time, watching the empty parking lot, feeling the quiet of the evening settle around her. For the first time, she began to understand how deep her assumptions had gone, how easy it was to believe you were doing the right thing when fear and bias were quietly guiding your choices. She walked to her car slowly, the sound of her shoes echoing against the pavement. She knew tomorrow would bring more questions, more apologies, maybe even consequences. But she also knew that this moment had changed her, whether she liked it or not, and somewhere across the city, the man she had called the police on was sitting in his office, thinking about how he could turn that painful experience into something that might open other people's eyes. Neither of them knew it yet. But this encounter, born from doubt and misunderstanding, was about to spark a much bigger conversation than either expected. The morning after the incident, the city woke up to headlines that spread faster than anyone expected. What had begun as a quiet misunderstanding inside a small suburban bank was now on every local news site, radio show, and social feed. The short video clip recorded by a customer had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times overnight. It was only 30 seconds long, just enough to show two officers walking into the bank speaking with a calm, well-dressed man, and the quiet realization on everyone's faces once the truth became clear. The caption said it all. Bank calls police on black man trying to access his own company account. Turns out he's the chairman. People were angry. Some were shocked. Others said they weren't surprised at all. By the time James arrived at his office that morning, reporters were already waiting outside the building. Camera crews stood near the entrance hoping to get a statement. Employees whispered quietly in the lobby, unsure of what to say to their boss. James walked through the doors calmly, greeting the front desk receptionist with a small nod. His assistant followed behind him carrying a stack of folders. Inside the elevator, the assistant finally spoke. "Sir, it's everywhere," he said quietly. "The video's viral. They're asking for a comment." James looked straight ahead, his voice even. "No comment for now." He stepped into his office, set his briefcase on the desk, and looked out through the large windows that showed the city below. The morning sun made the glass buildings shine, but the world outside felt heavier than usual. He didn't want this story to become about outrage or humiliation. He wanted it to become something that made people think. But he also knew that wasn't always how the internet worked. A knock came at the door. One of his senior managers stepped in, looking unsure. "Sir," the bank called. "The regional director wants to issue a formal apology. They'd also like to schedule a private meeting if you're open to it." James turned away from the window. "A meeting won't change what happened," he said quietly. "But yes, I'll listen." The manager nodded and left the room. For a long moment, James stood alone. He replayed everything in his head. The polite way he had spoken, the way the manager had looked at him with suspicion, the sound of the sirens. He could still feel the quiet eyes of everyone in that room watching him, waiting to see how he'd react. He sighed deeply and sat down at his desk. He wasn't angry at one person. He was disappointed by how normal this kind of mistake had become. Across town, inside the same glass bank building, the mood was completely different. Linda sat in her office, pale and tense, staring at the computer screen. Her inbox was full of messages from corporate news outlets and people she had never met before. The video was everywhere. Some people defended her, saying she was just being careful. Others called for her resignation. The regional office had already issued a public apology, but that didn't stop the calls from coming. Every few minutes, the phone rang again. Customers wanted to close their accounts. Others just wanted to say how disappointed they were. She had spent the entire morning trying not to cry. The staff kept their distance, speaking in low voices, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't just her reputation that had been damaged. The whole branch felt the weight of it. When her supervisor called, she knew what was coming. "Linda," his voice said over the speaker, calm but firm, "you'll need to meet with corporate this week. We're placing you on leave for now. There's a lot of attention on this, and we have to show that we're handling it seriously." She nodded even though he couldn't see her. "I understand." After hanging up, she sat there quietly for a long time, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner. Everything that had seemed so ordinary 2 days ago now felt distant, almost like it had happened to someone else. Later that afternoon, James received a call from the bank's main headquarters. The director's voice was polite but nervous. "Mr. Carter, I want to personally apologize for what happened at our branch yesterday. It was unacceptable. We're investigating the incident fully. We'd also like to meet with you to discuss how we can make this right." James listened silently, his hand resting on the desk. After a pause, he said, "What happened can't be fixed with words or money. What you can do is make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." The director agreed quickly. "Absolutely, sir. We'd also like to invite you to speak with our leadership team. Maybe share your experience so we can implement better training across all branches." James hesitated for a moment, then said, "I'll think about it." After the call, he leaned back in his chair. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want anyone humiliated. But he did want people to learn something from this. That evening, he received dozens of messages from friends and colleagues. Some were angry on his behalf. Others simply said they admired how calmly he had handled it. One message stood out. It was from a young employee in another company. It read, "Seeing how you stayed calm made me realize that dignity doesn't come from how people treat us, but from how we choose to respond." James smiled faintly. That, he thought, was the kind of reaction that mattered. Meanwhile, the bank's PR department was scrambling to control the damage. They released a statement saying they had zero tolerance for discrimination and that they were launching mandatory sensitivity and bias awareness programs. But people online weren't satisfied with corporate words. They wanted real change. Over the next few days, more details emerged. How Linda had ignored all the verified documents, how her assistant had confirmed everything was real before she still made the call. The story turned into a symbol of something larger, how small judgments could have big consequences. Reporters kept asking James for interviews. He finally agreed to one. Sitting across from a calm, respectful journalist, he spoke slowly and clearly. "I didn't share this story to embarrass anyone," he said. "I shared it because it shows how easy it is for people to act on fear instead of facts. I was polite. I had all the right papers. But it wasn't enough. That should make us all stop and think." The interviewer nodded. "What do you hope comes out of this?" "I hope people learn to pause before they judge, to ask instead of assume. That's all I want." When the interview aired, it touched people in a different way. James didn't speak with bitterness. He spoke with calm honesty, and that made the message even stronger. In homes, offices, and classrooms, people started discussing the story, not just what happened, but why it happened. At the same time, Linda stayed mostly silent. She avoided the news, avoided going out. Her friends called to check on her, but she didn't have much to say. One evening, she finally turned on the TV and saw James speaking in that interview. She watched him describe the experience, how he had felt, how he had chosen patience over anger. Something in his calmness made her cry. She realized he wasn't trying to ruin her. He was trying to make people see what fear and bias can do when they go unchecked. The next morning, she decided to write a letter. It wasn't for the media. It wasn't for the bank. It was for him. She wrote about her mistake, about the thoughts that had gone through her head that day, about the guilt that had followed her since. She ended with these words, "You taught me something without saying a single cruel word. I will remember that for the rest of my life." She mailed it quietly without expecting a reply. A few days later, James received the letter. He read it once, then again. He didn't know what to say, but he felt a quiet sense of peace. Not forgiveness exactly. That word felt too simple. But something close to understanding. He placed the letter in his drawer, beside other things that mattered to him, small reminders of moments that had changed his life in unexpected ways. Weeks passed. The story began to fade from the news, but its echo remained. People in banks, offices, and stores across the city talked differently. Training sessions were updated. Managers were reminded to ask questions before jumping to conclusions. James was invited to speak at a local community event about leadership and awareness. He stood on stage in front of a crowd of professionals, students, and neighbors. He spoke slowly, from the heart. "What happened to me," he said, "wasn't just about one person or one place. It was about the way we see each other. Every time we choose fear over understanding, we build another wall between us. But if we take 1 second to stop, to listen, to ask, "We can take that wall down." The audience was silent, listening closely. He ended with a smile that held no bitterness. Change doesn't start when we blame someone else. It starts when we look at ourselves. After his speech, people lined up to shake his hand. Some thanked him. Others apologized for things they had done in their own lives without realizing the harm. That night, when James returned home, he sat in his quiet living room and finally felt the weight lift off his shoulders. He knew the incident had hurt him, but he also knew it had created something meaningful. Meanwhile, across the city, Linda began volunteering at a local community center that focused on diversity and education. She didn't tell anyone who she was or what had happened, but she listened, really listened, to people's stories. For the first time, she understood how deeply those silent biases could cut. Months later, she saw another article online. It wasn't about the incident. It was about James and the program he had started, one that trained business professionals on empathy, communication, and fair judgment. She smiled softly. Maybe, in some small way, her mistake had led to something better. In the end, both of them were changed. Not by anger, but by awareness. And though they never met again, the moment that had begun with flashing lights and fear had grown into something far greater than either could have imagined. A quiet lesson about dignity, patience, and the power of choosing understanding over judgment. Weeks had passed since the incident, but the story hadn't truly disappeared. It had taken on a quieter life of its own, moving from the front pages of news sites to thoughtful conversations in offices, classrooms, and living rooms. People weren't just talking about what had happened. They were talking about what it meant. In small gatherings, community meetings, and workplace discussions, people used the story as an example of how simple bias can turn into something much larger, how calmness in the face of misunderstanding can lead to change, and how dignity can disarm even the harshest assumptions. For James, life had slowly returned to normal. The meetings, the deadlines, the travel, all the things that filled his days before were back. But something in him had shifted. He found himself speaking more openly with his team about empathy, respect, and awareness. He started including short discussions in staff meetings about human behavior and perception, things that rarely came up in business talks but now felt just as important as profit or performance. At first, his employees didn't know how to react. But slowly, they began to open up. They shared stories, some about their families, others about moments when they had felt invisible or judged unfairly. Those conversations changed the mood in the office. People became more patient with one another. Meetings felt different, calmer, kinder, more human. One morning, James sat in his office going through a stack of papers when his assistant walked in. "Sir," he said, "there's been another request from the Regional Bank Association. They'd like you to speak at their leadership summit next month." James leaned back slightly. "About the incident?" "Yes," his assistant said, "but also about what you've been doing since. They said they want it to be about leadership and accountability." James thought for a moment. He had already spoken at a few smaller events, but this would be different. This would be a room full of executives, decision-makers, the same kind of people who could change how things worked inside big institutions. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." Over the next few weeks, he prepared his speech. He didn't want to sound like he was lecturing anyone. He wanted to tell the story honestly, not as a victim, but as a man who saw a chance for learning. He worked late some nights, writing and rewriting until the words felt right. When the day of the summit arrived, the large hotel ballroom was filled with hundreds of people in suits and business attire. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation. When James took the stage, the room fell silent. He didn't start with statistics or policies. He started with a story. He told them about the morning he walked into a bank like any other customer, about how polite the staff had been at first, about the long wait, the strange looks, and finally the sound of sirens outside. He told it calmly, without anger. The crowd listened, quiet and still. Then he said something that made everyone lean forward. "What happened to me could have happened To anyone who looks different, sounds different, or doesn't fit someone's idea of who belongs. But here's what's more important. It could also have been prevented if someone had simply chosen to ask a question instead of making an assumption. He paused, letting the words sink in. "I'm not here to shame anyone," he continued. "I'm here to remind us that leadership isn't just about business decisions. It's about how we treat people, especially when we think no one is watching." When he finished speaking, the room erupted in quiet applause that quickly grew louder. Many people stood not because they felt obligated, but because they truly felt something shift inside them. Afterward, several executives came up to him. One of them, a senior leader from another bank, shook his hand and said, "That talk changed the way I see my own behavior. We all like to think we're fair, until we realize how often we act on small fears we don't even notice." James smiled gently. "Awareness is the first step," he said. "That's where real change starts." That evening, when he returned home, he sat by the window with a cup of tea. The city lights shimmered below. He thought about how one ordinary morning had turned into a lesson that was now reaching hundreds of people. He didn't plan it. He didn't want fame from it. But life has a strange way of turning pain into purpose when handled with patience. Across town, Linda was living a much quieter life. She had resigned from the bank a month after the incident. The pressure had been too much, and she felt she needed time to reflect. At first, she spent her days at home, avoiding news and social media. She went for long walks in the park, read books about human psychology, and tried to understand what had led her to act the way she did that day. One afternoon, while visiting a local cafe, she overheard two people discussing a recent business summit. One of them said, "Did you hear that talk by the Carter Holdings chairman? It was powerful. He spoke with so much grace. Made me rethink everything." Linda froze for a second, her heart tightening. She didn't join the conversation, but she listened quietly. The person continued. "He said something like, 'Ask before you assume.'" Simple words, but it hit hard. For the first time in a long while, Linda smiled faintly. She was glad he had turned the experience into something positive. It eased a small part of the guilt she still carried. Later that evening, she sat at her desk and opened her old work notebook. On one of the blank pages, she wrote a sentence in neat handwriting. "Every day, you meet people you don't understand. Try asking before assuming." She tore out the page and pinned it to her wall. A few weeks later, she started attending local workshops on bias and inclusion. Not as a speaker, not as an expert, but as a listener. She sat quietly, taking notes, learning, and reflecting. She met people who shared their own painful experiences, people who had been judged, doubted, or misunderstood because of how they looked, dressed, or spoke. Each story added another layer of awareness. She began volunteering to help organize these workshops, helping others find spaces to talk openly. Over time, she stopped seeing herself only as the woman who made a mistake and began seeing herself as someone trying to make things right. Meanwhile, the story of that one bank incident continued to ripple out into the world. Universities used it in ethics classes. HR teams used it as part of training sessions. Even community leaders referenced it when discussing fair treatment and empathy. What made the story powerful wasn't just what happened, it was how both people involved had responded. One had turned misunderstanding into education, the other had turned guilt into growth. Months later, James received another invitation, this time from a national leadership forum. They wanted him to give a keynote talk on grace under pressure. He thought about it carefully and eventually agreed. When the day came, he stood before an even larger crowd, hundreds of leaders from across industries, seated in rows beneath bright lights. He spoke not only about what had happened, but about what came after, the quiet messages, the apologies, the lessons learned. "I've come to realize," he said, "that progress doesn't always start with loud voices or public protests. Sometimes it begins with a quiet realization in someone's heart that maybe, just maybe, they've been seeing the world through the wrong lens." He paused, scanning the room. "Change isn't about being perfect," he said. "It's about being willing to see, to listen, and to admit when we could have done better. The audience was silent again, but it wasn't the heavy silence of guilt. It was thoughtful, introspective. After the event, people approached him to thank him. Some said his words reminded them of their own mistakes. Others said they finally understood the importance of empathy at work and beyond. A few months later, Carter Holdings launched a new program called the Human First Initiative. It focused on leadership training that combined business performance with emotional intelligence, fairness, and inclusion. Companies began signing up. Schools invited him to speak. Communities invited him to share his story. But James never let it turn into something self-centered. He always brought it back to the simple idea that started it all: ask before you assume. Even years later, that one line continued to echo. One spring afternoon, he received a letter. It was from a young bank employee who wrote, "Because of your story, our branch now does empathy training every month. Last week, I caught myself about to make a quick judgment about a customer, but I stopped. I remembered your words, and I asked instead. It changed the whole interaction." "Thank you," James smiled as he read it. That letter, like the one from Linda months before, reminded him that change doesn't happen in a single moment. It spread slowly, quietly, person by person. That night he walked through the city streets, watching people hurry by, some smiling, some tired, some lost in their thoughts. He realized that every one of them had a story. Every one of them carried something unseen, and maybe that was the real lesson all along: to treat every person like a story you haven't read yet. Across town, Linda sat in the same cafe she had visited months earlier. She was now helping a small organization that trained young professionals in emotional awareness. When one of the volunteers mentioned that the organization had been inspired by a businessman named James Carter, she smiled softly. She didn't say she knew him. She didn't tell her story. She just listened and felt quietly thankful that both of their paths had led to something meaningful. The memory of that morning at the bank would never completely fade, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a turning point. For both of them, what began as a misunderstanding had grown into something far deeper, a reminder of how fragile human perception can be, and how powerful humility and patience can become when given a chance. And as time moved forward, their story stopped being about one incident at a bank. It became a lesson people passed down, a story about awareness, change, and the quiet strength that comes from choosing to see others with open eyes instead of closed minds. Months had gone by since everything happened. The story that once filled news headlines now lived quietly in people's hearts. It wasn't just a story about a misunderstanding anymore. It had become a story about growth, forgiveness, and awareness. James had gone back to his usual work, but something inside him had changed forever. He looked at people differently now, not just employees, partners, or clients, but as human beings with their own struggles, fears, and dreams. Each morning, he started his day with a short walk through the park near his apartment. The air always felt cleaner in the morning, filled with the sound of birds and the distant noise of traffic waking up. Those walks gave him time to think, not about business, but about life. One morning, as he walked past the benches near the lake, he noticed an older man sitting quietly, feeding the ducks. The man looked up and smiled. They nodded at each other, two strangers sharing a peaceful moment. It was small, but James had come to value such quiet connections. Later that day, he arrived at his office and met with his leadership team. They had gathered to discuss the Human First Initiative, the program his company had launched months earlier. It was growing faster than anyone expected. One of his managers said, "Sir, more than 30 organizations have joined this month alone. They're using the training materials, and some have even created their own workshops." James nodded, pleased but calm. "That's good," he said. "It's not just about numbers. I want to make sure people are actually learning something, really seeing each other differently." He paused, then added, "Let's visit some of the companies ourselves. I want to talk to their teams directly." And he did. Over the next few weeks, he traveled from city to city, meeting people in conference rooms, schools, and community centers. He listened to their stories. Some people told him how they had caught themselves making assumptions about others and stopped in time. Others said his story had given them the courage to speak up when they saw unfair treatment. Each story touched him deeply. He realized that even though the incident at the bank had been painful, it had created something far greater than he ever imagined, a movement toward understanding. One afternoon, after finishing a workshop in a small town, a young woman approached him. She looked nervous but determined. "Sir," she said softly, "my father used to manage a local bank. He told me about what happened to you. He said it made him rethink how he talks to people. He used to judge customers by how they looked or dressed, but not anymore. He said he learned something from your calmness that day." James smiled. "That means a lot to me," he said. "Sometimes the lesson isn't in what we say, but in how we respond." That night, while sitting in his hotel room, James thought about how far things had come. He took out his notebook, the same one he used to write ideas, and wrote a few lines. One day, someone's misunderstanding became a lesson for us all. That's how change begins, not with blame, but with awareness. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Linda had also found a new rhythm in her life. She was no longer working in banking. Instead, she volunteered full-time for a small organization that focused on equality and emotional education in workplaces. It wasn't an easy road. The first few months had been hard. She had to face her own guilt, her own reflection, her own discomfort. But slowly she began to understand that growth only happens when you accept your mistakes and decide to do better. One day, while helping organize a workshop, the coordinator said, "We're planning to invite a special speaker next month, someone who's been making big changes in business ethics. His name is James Carter." Linda froze for a moment. She hadn't seen or spoken to him since that day. She wondered how he would react if they met again. When the day came, she sat quietly in the back of the room as James walked in. The audience clapped and he began speaking, calm, kind, and thoughtful as always. He shared stories of people who had turned small acts of misunderstanding into big steps toward empathy. His tone carried no bitterness, only hope. After the event ended, people gathered around to thank him. Linda waited until the crowd thinned out. Then she walked up slowly. When he turned and saw her, there was a short silence. "Hello," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to remember me." He smiled softly. "I do." She looked down for a moment. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not for forgiving me, but for turning that moment into something good. It helped me change my own life." James nodded. "We all grow in different ways," he said gently. "The fact that you're here means you've already taken the hardest step." They talked for a few minutes, not about the past, but about what they had both learned. There was no tension, no resentment, just understanding. When they parted, Linda felt lighter, as if a weight she'd been carrying for months had finally lifted. That night, James reflected on their conversation. It reminded him that forgiveness wasn't just something you give. It was something that frees both sides. A few months later, he was invited to a televised event where leaders from different industries discussed fairness and inclusion. When it was his turn to speak, he looked straight into the camera and said, "Sometimes the hardest thing we can do is to see the humanity in someone who has wronged us. But when we do, we make space for growth, theirs and ours." The audience applauded softly, not out of excitement, but out of respect. After the show, people reached out to him online, sharing stories about moments when they had chosen to act with patience instead of anger. It made him realize that kindness spreads like light, slowly, quietly but powerfully. As the year went on, the Human First Initiative became a permanent part of Carter Holdings. They built a small foundation that offered free workshops for schools and small businesses. Linda even joined as one of the volunteer trainers. The first time she spoke in front of a group, she was nervous. Her hands trembled slightly, but when she began telling her story, about that day, about how it changed her, the room grew still. She didn't name anyone. She didn't point fingers. She simply said, "I once made a mistake that came from fear, but someone's grace gave me the chance to see better. That's why I'm here today." When she finished, people stood and clapped, not because her story was dramatic, but because it was honest. Afterward, one of the attendees approached her and said, "It takes courage to admit that kind of mistake. Thank you for sharing. It gives me hope." Linda smiled. "We all make mistakes," she said. "It's what we do after that defines who we become." Meanwhile, James continued traveling and speaking, but he always stayed grounded. He still spent time with his team, still made time for quiet walks, still valued simple moments. One weekend, he visited a local school that had started using his program for students. The children had written essays about empathy and fairness. One essay caught his attention. It said, "When you treat people kindly, you don't just make them feel better. You make the world a little safer." He smiled, realizing that the message was reaching the next generation, exactly where it needed to be. As the sun set that evening, James stood by the window of his office looking out at the city. He thought about how far everything had come, from that one morning at a bank to a movement that now touched lives across the country. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even sad. He felt peace, the kind of peace that comes when you know something painful has been turned into something meaningful. He whispered to himself, "Maybe this is what purpose feels like." That night, he wrote one last line in his notebook. "True strength isn't in how loud we speak, but in how calmly we choose to understand."